Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into the royal bedchambers of history, but not for the reasons your perverted little minds are thinking. We're talking about the most fertile queens who ever lived, the women who turned pregnancy into a competitive sport and childbirth into a political weapon. The ladies who understood that in the Game of Thrones, your uterus was your most valuable piece on the board. So before we get started, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're genuinely fascinated by the intersection of biology and brutal medieval politics. And drop a comment letting me know which historical queen you think had the most strategic approach to motherhood, and whether you're listening to this at 2 a.m. like a proper history degenerate, or during your commute like a functional human being. Now grab your favorite beverage, maybe light a candle for ambience, and let's settle in for tonight's exploration of royal reproduction gone absolutely wild. So, you think being a fertile queen was all tiaras and baby showers? Precious. Really, like thinking a medieval plague was just a minor skin condition. These women weren't just popping out heirs like some kind of royal assembly line. They were strategic masterminds who understood that every pregnancy was a political gamble, every birth was a diplomatic negotiation, and every surviving child was a chess piece in a game where losing meant your entire bloodline got erased from history. Picture this. You wake up every morning knowing that your primary job description is professional baby factory with international implications. And failure doesn't just mean disappointment. It means your husband might literally remove your head to make room for a more productive wife. Welcome to the world where motherhood met monarchy, and both got absolutely brutal. Picture this, you're a princess, which sounds glamorous until you realize your primary job description reads professional baby factory with a crown. Welcome to the world of royal fertility, where your worth was measured not in wisdom, wit, or the ability to negotiate peace treaties, but in how many tiny humans you could produce before your uterus waved a white flag of surrender. Let's start with the obvious truth nobody wants to discuss at fancy dinner parties. Being a fertile queen wasn't about romantic moonlit walks or passionate love affairs. It was a relentless biological battlefield where your body was the contested territory, your womb was the prize, and everyone from your husband to your mother-in-law to complete strangers had opinions about your reproductive schedule. You weren't just a person, you were a walking, talking insurance policy for an entire dynasty. Take Catherine of Aragon, for instance. Poor Catherine thought she was marrying Henry Valley for love, politics, and maybe some decent English weather. Wrong on all counts. Henry's idea of romance was checking her menstrual cycle like a farmer monitoring his prize breeding mare. Every month that passed without an heir was another month closer to Henry's inevitable tantrum, which, spoiler alert, eventually involved beheading people and starting his own church. Catherine managed to produce one surviving child, Mary, but apparently, daughters didn't count in Henry's mathematics of monarchy. One healthy girl versus 6 dead babies and countless miscarriages. Failure, according to Henry's scorecard. But Catherine was a rookie compared to some of history's real champions of childbirth. Enter Maria Theresa of Austria, who took the phrase, "be fruitful and multiply," as a personal challenge. 16 children. 16. That's not a family, that's a small village with matching DNA. Maria Theresa spent roughly 20 years of her life pregnant, which means she experienced morning sickness for longer than most people spend in school. Her husband, Francis I, probably needed a calendar just to remember all his children's names. Maria Theresa's approach to motherhood was refreshingly practical. She didn't pretend pregnancy was some magical, glowing experience. She acknowledged it was exhausting, painful, and politically necessary. Her letters to her children read like a combination of motherly advice and military strategy. She'd lecture her daughters about the importance of producing heirs while simultaneously running the Habsburg Empire. Talk about multitasking. Now, if Maria Theresa was impressive, Anna of Russia was terrifying. Not because she was mean, but because her reproductive output could power a small factory. Anna managed to survive multiple pregnancies in an era where childbirth was essentially Russian roulette with extra bleeding. Russian winters, limited medical knowledge, and the constant threat of political assassination weren't exactly ideal conditions for raising children. Yet Anna persevered with the determination of someone who understood that royal survival depended on numerical superiority. Russian royal women had it particularly rough. They weren't just expected to produce heirs, they were expected to produce heirs who could survive Russian winters, Russian politics, and Russian vodka. Anna's children had to be tough enough to handle palace intrigue before they could walk properly. Imagine explaining to a toddler why Uncle Ivan suddenly disappeared, and why they shouldn't ask questions about the screaming from the dungeon. But let's talk about the real champion, the Michael Jordan of royal reproduction, Eleanor of Aquitaine. This woman didn't just have children, she collected them like expensive jewelry. Eleanor produced heirs with two different husbands, King Louis the Hero of France and King Henry Hero of England, proving that divorce wasn't necessarily a career-ending move if you knew how to leverage your fertility properly. Eleanor's first marriage to Louis the was, by medieval standards, a disaster, not because they didn't love each other, but because Eleanor only managed to produce daughters. Two daughters. In the 12th century, daughters were lovely but ultimately useless for inheritance purposes. Louis needed sons, and Eleanor's uterus seemed to specialize in princesses. The medieval equivalent of constantly rolling the wrong number on a dice that determined your kingdom's future. So Eleanor did what any reasonable woman would do in her situation. She got a divorce, packed her bags, married Henry II of England, and proceeded to demonstrate that her reproductive system worked just fine. Thank you very much. With Henry, Eleanor produced 8 children, including 5 sons. 5 sons! That's not luck, that's biological revenge. Eleanor essentially proved that sometimes the problem isn't the equipment, it's the management. Henry, meanwhile, went from being a lucky husband to an overwhelmed father. 5 sons meant 5 potential heirs, which sounds great until you realize it also meant 5 potential civil wars. Eleanor's boys didn't just inherit kingdoms, they inherited their parents' talent for political drama. Richard the Lionheart spent most of his reign fighting crusades instead of ruling England. John lost most of the family's French territories and got bullied into signing the Magna Carta. Geoffrey died in a tournament because apparently medieval entertainment was just organized attempted murder. Eleanor's reproductive success came with a price. She spent years under house arrest because Henry II got tired of her political meddling. Apparently, producing heirs gave medieval women the mistaken impression that they should have opinions about how kingdoms were run. Henry's solution was essentially royal grounding. Eleanor could keep her title and her children, but she couldn't leave her castle without permission. Medieval men had creative ways of handling strong women, but Eleanor's story illustrates something important about royal fertility. It wasn't just about having babies. It was about having the right babies at the right time, with the right political connections. Eleanor's children with Louis VI were perfectly healthy girls who eventually became queens of other kingdoms. But in France, they were considered failures. Her sons with Henry VI were successful because they inherited not just genetic material, but also strategic political positioning. The pressure on royal women to produce male heirs was insane by any reasonable standard. Imagine if your job performance was evaluated solely on the gender of your offspring, which you had absolutely no control over. Medieval medicine didn't understand chromosomes, so queens were blamed for producing daughters, as if they had personally chosen to disappoint everyone. The king's sperm determined gender, but somehow queens got fired for not producing sons. Medieval logic at its finest. This brings us to Catherine the Great of Russia, who took a different approach to the fertility game. Catherine understood that political power was more important than biological productivity. She had one son, Paul, and then focused on conquering countries instead of producing more children. Catherine's strategy was brilliant. Instead of trying to fill a nursery, she filled a map. By the time she was done ruling, Russia was significantly larger and more powerful. Her single son inherited an empire, which was probably more valuable than having 12 sons inherit smaller kingdoms. Catherine the Great's approach highlights how different queens handled the impossible demands of royal fertility. Some, like Maria Theresa, embraced the challenge and turned pregnancy into a competitive sport. Others, like Catherine the Great, decided that one healthy heir was sufficient and redirected their energy toward empire building. Both strategies worked, but they required completely different personalities and political situations. Let's discuss another fascinating case, Queen Victoria of England, who managed to combine impressive fertility with shocking longevity. Victoria had 9 children and lived long enough to see her grandchildren become adults. This was unusual because most queens either died young from childbirth complications or lived long lives with few children. Victoria managed both high fertility and long life, which allowed her to personally influence European politics for decades. Victoria's children married into royal families across Europe, earning her the nickname Grandmother of Europe. Her reproductive strategy wasn't just about producing heirs for England. It was about creating a genetic network of political alliances. Victoria's descendants ruled Germany, Russia, Spain, and numerous smaller kingdoms. She essentially used her children as diplomatic tools, which sounds cold but was incredibly effective. The downside of Victoria's reproductive success was haemophilia. Victoria carried the gene for haemophilia, which she passed to several of her children and grandchildren. Royal families across Europe suddenly found themselves dealing with a genetic condition that caused excessive bleeding from minor injuries. Victoria's great-grandson, Alexei Romanov, heir to the Russian throne, suffered from haemophilia so severe that it contributed to the political instability that eventually led to the Russian Revolution. Victoria's case demonstrates how royal fertility could have unintended consequences across multiple generations. Her reproductive success in the 19th century directly influenced 20th century European politics. The interconnected web of royal marriages that Victoria created through her children meant that World War I was essentially a family dispute that got out of hand. Cousins were fighting cousins, and Victoria's genetic legacy was scattered across both sides of the conflict. But perhaps the most strategically brilliant fertile queen was Isabella of Castile. Isabella understood that producing children wasn't enough. You had to produce children who could consolidate and expand political power. Isabella had 5 children, and she used each one as a carefully placed chess piece in European politics. Her daughter Catherine became Queen of England through marriage to Henry V. Her daughter Joanna inherited Castile. Her son Juan was positioned to inherit Aragon. Isabella's reproductive strategy was like playing 4-dimensional chess while pregnant. She wasn't just thinking about immediate succession, she was planning multiple generations ahead. Isabella's grandchildren included Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who ruled vast territories across Europe and the Americas. Through careful marriage planning and strategic fertility, Isabella's genetic legacy controlled more territory than any queen in history. The physical reality of constant pregnancy for these queens was brutal beyond modern comprehension. No epidurals, no antibiotics, no understanding of infection control. Medieval and early modern medicine was essentially educated guessing with occasionally fatal consequences. Queens gave birth in rooms full of people offering unhelpful advice, while midwives with questionable training did their best with primitive tools. Infant mortality was so high that having multiple pregnancies was essentially required to ensure even 1 or 2 children survived to adulthood. Queens couldn't have just one child and assume their succession was secure. They needed backup heirs and backup heirs. This meant years of continuous pregnancy, childbirth, recovery, and immediate pregnancy. Their bodies never got breaks. The psychological pressure was equally brutal. Every miscarriage was a political crisis. Every daughter instead of a son was a diplomatic failure. Every infant death was both personal tragedy and national emergency. Queens had to grieve privately while maintaining public composure and immediately trying to conceive again. The emotional toll of this cycle was never acknowledged or addressed. Let's consider Empress Wu Zetian of China, who took a completely different approach to the fertility game. Wu understood that in Chinese imperial politics, producing children was important, but controlling existing children was more important. Wu had several children, but she's more famous for allegedly killing some of them to frame political rivals. Whether these stories are true or Tang Dynasty propaganda is debatable, but Wu's reputation illustrates how royal fertility could become a weapon rather than just a biological function. Wu's strategy was to use her children strategically while eliminating threats to her power. She understood that in palace politics, too many potential heirs could be dangerous if they were controlled by ambitious relatives or court factions. Wu's approach was ruthlessly practical. Have enough children to ensure succession, but not so many that they become tools for your enemies. Chinese imperial concubine systems created unique challenges for fertile women. The emperor had multiple wives and concubines, all competing to produce male heirs. Success in this system required not just fertility, but political cunning, strategic alliances, and sometimes elimination of rivals. Chinese imperial women had to navigate complex hierarchies where pregnancy could elevate your status or make you a target for assassination. Empress Wu's story also highlights how different cultures handled royal fertility. European queens were expected to be faithful wives who produced legitimate heirs. Chinese imperial women operated in polygamous systems, where competition between mothers was institutionalized. Islamic royal women faced similar challenges in harem systems. Each culture created different pressures and strategies for fertile queens. Speaking of Islamic royal women, let's discuss Roxolana, wife of Suleiman the Magnificent of the Ottoman Empire. Roxolana started as a concubine in the imperial harem, but she used her fertility strategically to become Suleiman's legal wife and most powerful advisor. She had 6 children with Suleiman, and she used these relationships to influence Ottoman politics for decades. Roxolana's rise from concubine to queen mother illustrates how fertility could be a path to power in some political systems. She understood that producing Suleiman's children gave her leverage that other women in the harem lacked. But Roxolana didn't stop at having children. She positioned herself as Suleiman's closest advisor and influenced major political decisions. Her fertility was just the first step in a larger political strategy. The Ottoman imperial system created unique opportunities for ambitious women. Unlike European queens who were born into royal families, Ottoman imperial women could rise through the ranks based on their relationships with the Sultan and their success in producing heirs. This system was more meritocratic in some ways, but it also created intense competition and frequent violence between women competing for the Sultan's attention. Roxolana's children faced their own challenges. Ottoman succession was determined by military strength rather than birth order, which meant that Roxolana's sons were expected to compete against each other for the throne. She spent years maneuvering to ensure that her preferred son would inherit the empire. This system ensured that only the strongest princes became sultans, but it also guaranteed that royal families were constantly plotting against each other. Let's return to European fertility champions and discuss Anne of Austria, Queen of France and mother of Louis XIV. Anne waited 23 years to produce an heir, which in royal terms was an eternity. Her subjects began to suspect she was cursed or that her marriage to Louis Siphan was somehow defective. When Anne finally gave birth to the future Sun King, it was considered a miracle rather than normal biology. Anne's reproductive struggles illustrate how royal fertility was viewed through religious and superstitious lenses. Her subjects interpreted her long infertility as divine punishment or evidence of moral failings. When she finally produced Louis XIV, it was seen as proof that God approved of her reign. This religious interpretation of royal fertility added spiritual pressure to the already overwhelming political and personal pressures these women faced. Louis XIV's birth was so politically significant that witnesses were required to confirm it actually happened. Court officials, nobles, and clergy crowded into Anne's birthing chamber to verify that she actually delivered a legitimate male heir. Imagine giving birth with dozens of strangers watching and taking notes for historical records. Medieval royal women had no privacy during the most vulnerable moments of their lives. Anne's case also demonstrates how royal fertility could be affected by political stress. Her marriage to Louis XIV was arranged for diplomatic purposes, and their personal relationship was reportedly cold and distant. The pressure to produce heirs in a loveless marriage, while managing complex court politics, couldn't have been conducive to conception. Yet queens were expected to overcome these psychological obstacles through sheer willpower. This brings us to one of history's most strategically successful fertile queens, Margaret of Anjou, who used her reproductive capacity to maintain political power during the Wars of the Roses. Margaret had one son, Edward of Westminster, but she leveraged his existence into decades of political influence. She understood that being the mother of a potential king was almost as powerful as being a queen in her own right. Margaret's approach was different from Queen's, who focused on quantity. She invested all her political energy in protecting and promoting her single son. When her husband, Henry VI, proved to be mentally unstable and politically ineffective, Margaret essentially became the leader of the Lancastrian faction. She used her role as mother to justify her unprecedented political activity. Margaret's strategy worked until it didn't. Her son Edward died at the Battle of Tewkesbury, ending the Lancastrian line and Margaret's political relevance. This illustrates the fundamental risk of the royal fertility game. All your political investments were tied to the survival of biologically vulnerable children. Margaret went from being one of the most powerful women in England to being politically irrelevant because of a single military defeat. The Wars of the Roses period shows how royal fertility became weaponized during civil conflicts. Different factions claimed legitimacy based on their reproductive connections to previous kings. The conflict wasn't just about political control, it was about whose children had the best genetic claim to the throne. Fertile queens found themselves at the center of military conflicts that could last for generations. Let's discuss another fascinating case, Blanche of Castile, mother of Louis VI of France. Blanche had 12 children, but more importantly, she understood how to use her fertility to maintain political control during her son's minority. When her husband died and Louis VI was still a child, Blanche became regent and ruled France for nearly a decade. Blanche's regency demonstrates how successful queens could translate reproductive success into long-term political power. She didn't just produce heirs, she positioned herself as the indispensable guardian of those heirs. French nobles who might have challenged a queen regnant found it harder to oppose a queen mother who was clearly acting in her son's interests. Blanche's multiple pregnancies also gave her political insurance. If something happened to Louis VI, she had other sons who could potentially inherit the throne. This backup system allowed her to take political risks that queens with single heirs couldn't afford. Her fertility created political stability that lasted beyond her own lifetime. The medieval period created unique challenges for fertile queens because medical knowledge was so limited. Queens relied on prayer, folk remedies, and luck to survive childbirth. Many of the most politically successful queens were also the most biologically fortunate. They survived multiple pregnancies that would have killed less lucky women. Consider Berengaria of Navarre, wife of Richard the Lionheart. Berengaria's story illustrates how royal fertility could be complicated by husbands who were more interested in military campaigns than producing heirs. Richard spent most of their marriage fighting in the Holy Land, leaving Berengaria with limited opportunities to fulfill her reproductive obligations. She never had children, which made her marriage politically pointless from a dynastic perspective. Berengaria's situation shows how royal fertility required cooperation from both partners, but medieval marriage customs gave wives limited control over their husbands' schedules. If the king decided to spend years fighting crusades, the queen's fertility became irrelevant regardless of her biological capabilities. This added another layer of uncertainty to an already unpredictable process. The Crusades period created particular challenges for royal fertility because European kings frequently abandoned their kingdoms for military campaigns in the Middle East. Queens were left to manage domestic politics while waiting for their husbands to return and hopefully participate in producing heirs. Some queens never saw their husbands long enough to have children. Let's examine another Chinese case, Empress Dowager Cixi, who used her position as mother of the emperor to control the Qing dynasty for nearly 50 years. Cixi started as a low-ranking concubine, but she gave birth to the Tongji emperor and used this relationship to become the real power behind the throne. Her case illustrates how fertility could be a launching pad for unprecedented political authority. Cixi's strategy was to maintain control by ensuring that subsequent emperors were either her biological children or children she could influence. When the Tongji emperor died without heirs, Cixi arranged for her nephew to become emperor and continued ruling as regent. She understood that controlling the succession process was more important than just producing heirs. The Chinese imperial system allowed for more flexible approaches to royal fertility because of the concubine system and adoption practices. If a queen didn't produce male heirs, the emperor could select successors from among his other children or adopt relatives. This reduced the pressure on individual women, while creating different types of political competition. Cixi 40, 7-year influence over Chinese imperial politics demonstrates how successful royal mothers could extend their power far beyond their reproductive years. She transitioned from being valued for her fertility to being respected for her political skills. This evolution was rare in most royal systems, which typically discarded queens after their childbearing years ended. Now let's discuss some of the more unusual approaches to royal fertility. Take Christina of Sweden, who rejected the entire system. Christina abdicated her throne rather than marry and produce heirs, choosing intellectual pursuits over biological obligations. Her decision shocked European royal society because it challenged the fundamental assumption that royal women existed primarily for reproductive purposes. Christina's abdication illustrates the constraints that royal fertility expectations placed on women's choices. She was one of the most educated and intellectually gifted rulers of her era, but Swedish law required her to marry and produce male heirs to secure the succession. Christina decided that personal autonomy was more valuable than royal power, which was an almost unthinkable choice for a 17th century monarch. Christina's cousin Charles inherited her throne and successfully produced heirs, proving that royal fertility obligations could be transferred to other family members. But Christina's case remains unique because she voluntarily gave up power rather than submit to reproductive expectations. Most queens who failed to produce heirs were forced from power. Christina chose to leave before anyone could force her. The Swedish royal family's approach to Christina's situation was relatively progressive for its time. Instead of forcing her into marriage or declaring her illegitimate, they allowed her to abdicate with dignity and transfer power to a male relative. This solution preserved dynastic stability while respecting Christina's personal choices, though it was probably motivated more by political pragmatism than feminist principles. Let's return to more conventional fertility champions and examine Catherine de' Medici, who had 10 children and used them to dominate French politics for decades. Catherine understood that royal fertility was a long-term investment strategy. She didn't just produce heirs, she created a dynasty that controlled France through multiple generations. Catherine's approach was methodical and strategic. She married her children to secure political alliances, eliminate threats, and expand French influence across Europe. Her daughter Elizabeth became Queen of Spain. Her daughter Margot married the future Henry IV of France. Her sons ruled France consecutively as Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. Catherine essentially turned motherhood into a profession. The religious wars period in France created unique opportunities for fertile queens like Catherine. Political instability meant that traditional power structures were fluid, and successful mothers could leverage their children's claims to influence major events. Catherine used her role as Queen Mother to mediate between Catholic and Protestant factions, sometimes favouring one side and sometimes the other based on her family's interests. Catherine's 10 children also created problems. Multiple potential heirs meant multiple opportunities for civil conflict. Her sons competed against each other and against other claimants to the French throne. Catherine spent her later years trying to prevent her own children from destroying each other, which is probably not what she envisioned when she was focusing on fertility in her younger years. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where thousands of Protestant Huguenots were killed, was partly attributed to Catherine's political manoeuvring. Her fertility had given her the political influence to orchestrate major historical events, but these events had consequences that extended far beyond her family's immediate interests. Royal fertility could amplify individual decisions into national tragedies. Let's examine another angle of royal fertility, the international marriage market. Fertile queens were essentially trading their reproductive capacity for political alliances, but this system required careful negotiation and strategic thinking. Consider the case of Isabel of Portugal, who married Charles V and produced Philip Thierry of Spain. Isabel's marriage to Charles V united the Spanish and Portuguese royal lines, but it also meant that she spent her fertile years producing heirs for a husband who ruled territories across Europe and the Americas. Her children inherited not just kingdoms, but global empires. Isabel's reproductive success had consequences on multiple continents. The international marriage system meant that fertile queens often lived far from their birth families and had to adapt to foreign cultures while managing their reproductive obligations. Isabel had to learn Spanish customs, Catholic practices, and Habsburg family politics while simultaneously producing heirs for one of the most powerful rulers in European history. Isabel's son Philip II inherited Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and vast American territories. Her fertility contributed to the creation of one of history's largest empires, but it also meant that her descendants would spend centuries managing colonial rebellions, religious conflicts, and economic challenges across multiple continents. Royal fertility could have global consequences that lasted for generations. The Habsburg family's approach to marriage and fertility created both unprecedented power and serious genetic problems. They preferred to marry cousins to keep wealth and territory within the family, but this inbreeding eventually produced rulers like Charles VI of Spain, who was so genetically compromised that he couldn't produce heirs despite multiple marriages. The same strategic fertility that built the Habsburg Empire eventually destroyed it. Let's discuss a different cultural approach to royal fertility, the Celtic tradition of female rulers who were expected to be both fertile and warriors. Boudica of the Iceni had daughters and led military campaigns against Roman occupation. Her case illustrates how some cultures combined reproductive expectations with military leadership in ways that would have been impossible in most medieval European kingdoms. Boudica's rebellion against Roman rule was partly motivated by Roman attempts to control her daughters and her tribe's succession practices. Roman law didn't recognize female inheritance rights, which conflicted with Celtic traditions that allowed women to rule and pass power to their children. Boudica's fertility was politically significant, not just because she had children, but because those children represented legitimate claims to tribal leadership. The Roman conquest of Celtic territories often involved conflicts over marriage and succession customs. Roman administrators tried to impose their own legal systems, which typically excluded women from inheritance and political power. Celtic queens like Boudica found themselves fighting not just for political independence, but for cultural survival and their children's rights. Boudica's daughters disappeared from historical records after her defeat, which probably means they were killed, enslaved, or forced into marriages that eliminated their political significance. Her fertility, which had been a source of political strength in Celtic society, became a vulnerability when confronted with Roman military power and legal systems. This brings us to an important point about royal fertility. Its political value was entirely dependent on the surrounding legal and cultural systems. The same reproductive capacity that made a woman powerful in one context could make her vulnerable in another. Queens had to understand not just biology, but law, custom, religion, and politics. Let's examine another impressive fertility champion, Marie Antoinette's mother, Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, who we mentioned earlier but deserve more detailed discussion. Maria Theresa's 16 children weren't just a personal achievement, they were a diplomatic revolution. She used her children to create political alliances across Europe in ways that previous generations of rulers could never have imagined. Maria Theresa's approach to royal fertility was systematic and ambitious. She treated each pregnancy as an opportunity to strengthen Austria's political position. Her daughters became queens of France, Naples, and Parma. Her sons inherited territories across the Habsburg Empire. She essentially used her reproductive capacity to create a European political network centered on Vienna. The logistics of managing 16 children while ruling an empire were staggering. Maria Theresa had to balance pregnancy and childbirth with military campaigns, diplomatic negotiations, and domestic policy. She gave birth during the War of Austrian Succession and continued ruling while nursing infants. Her case illustrates how royal fertility required superhuman time management skills. Maria Theresa's correspondence with her children reveals her approach to motherhood as statecraft. She lectured her daughters about their duties as wives and mothers, while simultaneously advising them on political strategy. Her letters combined maternal affection with diplomatic instruction. She understood that her children's success as parents would determine Austria's long-term political stability. The most famous of Maria Theresa's children was Marie Antoinette, whose fertility struggles contributed to the French Revolution. Marie Antoinette's difficulty producing heirs made her a target for political criticism and popular resentment. Her mother's reproductive success made her daughter's fertility problems seem more significant and politically damaging. Marie Antoinette's case illustrates how royal fertility expectations could intensify over generations. Maria Theresa's success raised the bar for her daughters, who were expected to match their mother's reproductive achievements while managing increasingly complex political situations. The pressure on second-generation royal women was often more intense than what their mothers had faced. Let's consider another angle: the role of royal mistresses in fertility politics. Kings often had official mistresses who produced acknowledged illegitimate children, creating complex succession situations. Diane de Poitiers, mistress of Henry II of France, never had children with the king, but influenced his relationship with his wife Catherine de' Medici and helped manage the royal family's reproductive strategy. The mistress system created unique challenges for legitimate queens. They had to compete not just with other potential wives, but with women who could provide emotional and sexual satisfaction without the political complications of legitimate marriage. Queens like Catherine de' Medici had to maintain their positions while acknowledging their husbands' other relationships. Some royal mistresses were more fertile than the legitimate queens, which created succession crises and political instability. Charles II of England acknowledged multiple illegitimate children with various mistresses, but his wife Catherine of Braganza never produced heirs. This situation meant that Charles's brothers inherited the throne, creating the political conditions that led to the Glorious Revolution. The illegitimate children of royal mistresses often became significant political figures in their own right. The Duke of Monmouth, illegitimate son of Charles II, led a rebellion against James II, based partly on his claim that he was the rightful Protestant heir to the throne. Royal fertility politics extended beyond legitimate marriages to include complex webs of acknowledged and unacknowledged relationships. Now let's discuss the medical realities that these fertile queens faced. Medieval and early modern medicine had no understanding of reproductive biology, infection control, or pain management. Queens gave birth without anesthesia, antibiotics, or basic hygiene. The mortality rate for both mothers and infants was horrifying by modern standards. Royal physicians often made fertility problems worse through their treatments. Bloodletting, purging, and bizarre dietary restrictions were common medical interventions that probably reduced rather than improved reproductive success. Queens were subjected to these treatments because they were considered state-of-the-art medicine, but they were essentially expensive ways of weakening already stressed bodies. The psychological pressure of royal fertility was compounded by the lack of medical privacy. Queens' menstrual cycles, pregnancy symptoms, and childbirth experiences were monitored and discussed by court officials, physicians, and foreign ambassadors. Modern people can barely imagine the stress of having your reproductive health treated as a matter of international political significance. Superstition played a major role in royal fertility practices. Queens wore special amulets, followed complex dietary restrictions, and participated in religious ceremonies designed to improve their reproductive success. These practices probably had no biological effect, but they provided psychological comfort in situations where medical science offered no reliable solutions. Let's examine how royal fertility intersected with religious politics. Catholic queens were expected to produce male heirs, while also demonstrating appropriate religious devotion. Protestant queens faced similar pressures, but had to navigate different theological expectations about women's roles and religious authority. The Reformation created new challenges for royal fertility, because it disrupted traditional religious justifications for political authority. Catholic queens could appeal to the Virgin Mary as a model of sacred motherhood. But Protestant queens had to develop different theological frameworks for understanding their reproductive roles. Religious conflicts often involved disputes about royal succession and fertility. The English Civil War was partly about whether Charles I's Catholic wife could influence the religious upbringing of their children. Royal fertility became entangled with theological debates about religious authority and national identity. Queens who failed to produce heirs were sometimes blamed for divine punishment or spiritual failings. This religious interpretation of fertility problems added guilt and shame to the already overwhelming pressures these women faced. They were expected to accept reproductive difficulties as evidence of their moral inadequacy rather than biological misfortune. Let's return to specific cases and examine Joanna of Castile, known as Joanna the Mad, whose fertility was complicated by mental health issues and political manipulation. Joanna had 6 children with her husband Philip the Handsome, but her emotional instability made her a target for political rivals who questioned her fitness to rule. Joanna's case illustrates how royal fertility could be weaponized against women who didn't conform to expected behavioral norms. Her passion for her husband was interpreted as evidence of mental instability, and her grief after his death was used to justify removing her from political power. Her fertility was acknowledged, but considered insufficient to compensate for her psychological problems. The political manipulation of Joanna's reproductive capacity and mental health had long-term consequences for Spanish succession. Her son Charles V inherited vast territories, partly because his mother was declared unfit to rule despite being the legitimate heir. Joanna's fertility created the next generation of rulers, but her mental health was used to exclude her from political authority. Joanna spent most of her adult life under house arrest, supposedly for her own protection, but really to prevent her from interfering with her son's political authority. Her case demonstrates how royal fertility could become a liability if it was combined with behavior that threatened male relatives' political control. The story of Joanna the Mad also highlights the intersection between royal fertility and medical understanding of mental health. Medieval and early modern medicine had no effective treatments for what were probably postpartum depression, bipolar disorder, or other psychological conditions. Queens who exhibited mental health symptoms were typically isolated rather than treated. Let's discuss another complex case, Anne Boleyn, whose fertility struggles contributed to one of history's most famous royal divorces. Anne had one surviving child, Elizabeth I, but her inability to produce male heirs gave Henry the excuse he needed to have her executed. Her case illustrates how royal fertility could become literally a matter of life and death. Anne Boleyn's situation was complicated by the fact that Henry VI had already divorced one wife for failing to produce male heirs. Anne knew that her reproductive success would determine not just her political position, but her physical survival. The pressure she faced was unprecedented even by royal standards. Anne's pregnancy struggles were monitored and analysed by court officials, foreign ambassadors, and political rivals looking for evidence that could be used against her. Her miscarriages were interpreted as signs of divine displeasure or moral corruption. She had no privacy during the most vulnerable periods of her life. The execution of Anne Boleyn sent a message to other queens about the consequences of reproductive failure. Henry V demonstrated that queens were expendable if they couldn't fulfill their biological obligations. This created a climate of terror for subsequent wives who understood that their fertility was directly linked to their survival. Anne's daughter Elizabeth I never married or had children, partly because she understood how dangerous royal fertility could be for women. Elizabeth chose political power over biological reproduction, which was an almost unique decision for a 16th century monarch. Her choice was probably influenced by her mother's fate. Let's examine the fertility strategies of queens who ruled in their own right rather than as wives of kings. Christina of Sweden abdicated rather than marry, but other queens regnant found ways to balance reproductive obligations with political authority. Mary I of England married Philip II of Spain partly to secure the Catholic succession, but she died without producing heirs. Elizabeth I of England chose never to marry, which eliminated the possibility of producing heirs, but also prevented any husband from claiming authority over her kingdom. Elizabeth's decision was strategically brilliant, but dynastically disastrous. She died without children, ending the Tudor line and creating succession uncertainty. Queens regnant faced unique challenges because they needed to produce heirs while maintaining their political authority. Marriage typically involved transferring some degree of authority to their husbands, but remaining unmarried meant accepting dynastic extinction. Most queens regnant chose marriage and hoped to manage the political consequences. The few successful queens, regnant who managed both marriage and political authority, were exceptional in their political skills and personal circumstances. Maria I of Portugal married, but retained effective control over her kingdom. Catherine II of Russia eliminated her husband and ruled as an empress regnant, while having one son to secure the succession. Now let's discuss the economic aspects of royal fertility. Producing heirs was expensive because it required maintaining households, hiring tutors, arranging marriages, and supporting children who might not inherit thrones but still needed appropriate lifestyles. Royal fertility was an investment that required long-term financial planning. The cost of royal fertility extended beyond immediate child rearing expenses to include diplomatic negotiations, wedding ceremonies, and military campaigns to secure succession rights. Queens like Maria Theresa spent enormous amounts of money arranging marriages for their children and supporting their political activities across Europe. Royal children who didn't inherit thrones still required appropriate marriages and financial support. Younger sons needed military commissions or church positions. Daughters needed dowries and politically advantageous marriages. The financial obligations of royal fertility lasted decades beyond the actual childbearing years. Some kingdoms were nearly bankrupted by the costs of maintaining large royal families. The elaborate court ceremonies, diplomatic missions, and military campaigns required to support royal fertility strategies consumed resources that might have been used for infrastructure, education, or economic development. Let's consider how royal fertility intersected with colonial expansion and global politics. Queens like Isabella of Castile used their children to justify and facilitate overseas expansion. Isabella's daughter Joanna married into the Habsburg family, creating dynastic claims that eventually led to Spanish control over vast American territories. The colonial period created new dimensions for royal fertility because European queens were producing heirs who would rule over populations on multiple continents. The children of fertile queens like Isabella weren't just inheriting European kingdoms. They were inheriting global empires with millions of subjects they would never meet. Colonial wealth flowed back to European royal families, partly because of strategic marriages arranged by fertile queens. The gold and silver that Spanish conquistadors extracted from the Americas funded European wars and court ceremonies that celebrated the fertility of Habsburg queens. Royal reproduction had become a global economic force. The genetic mixing that resulted from royal fertility strategies also had colonial implications. Spanish royal children carried claims to territories across Europe and the Americas. Portuguese royal children inherited African trading posts and Asian colonies. Dutch royal children controlled shipping routes and island territories. Royal fertility was reshaping the global political map. Indigenous populations in colonized territories found themselves ruled by European monarchs whose legitimacy derived partly from their mothers' reproductive success. The fertility of queens like Isabella had direct consequences for millions of people who had no voice in European succession politics, but were nevertheless subject to rulers chosen through European dynastic systems. Let's examine another dimension of royal fertility, the role of wet nurses and child rearing practices. Royal children were typically raised by professional staff rather than their biological mothers, which meant that fertile queens could focus on producing more heirs rather than personally caring for existing children. The wet nurse system allowed queens like Maria Theresa to maintain nearly continuous pregnancy cycles because they weren't breastfeeding their existing children. This artificial separation of reproduction from child rearing enabled higher fertility rates, but also created emotional distance between royal mothers and their children. Royal children raised by wet nurses and professional staff often had closer relationships with their caregivers than with their biological mothers. This system prioritized reproductive efficiency over maternal bonding, which had psychological consequences that lasted throughout these children's lives and influenced their own approaches to parenthood. The professional child rearing system also meant that royal fertility strategies could continue even if individual queens died in childbirth. Surviving children would be raised by the same staff systems, and kings could remarry and continue producing heirs without major disruption to existing child care arrangements. Some queens tried to maintain personal relationships with their children despite the professional child rearing system. Maria Theresa wrote extensive letters to her children providing both maternal advice and political instruction. But most queens accepted the separation as necessary for both reproductive efficiency and political stability. Now let's discuss the international espionage aspects of royal fertility. Foreign ambassadors monitored queens' menstrual cycles, pregnancy symptoms, and childbirth outcomes because this information was crucial for diplomatic and military planning. Royal fertility had become a matter of international intelligence. Diplomatic correspondence from this period includes detailed reports about queens' health, pregnancy progress, and infant survival rates. These reports were encrypted and sent through secure channels because the information could influence alliance negotiations, trade agreements, and military strategies. Rival kingdoms sometimes attempted to interfere with royal fertility through poison, cursed objects, or magical rituals. Whether these attempts were effective is debatable, but the fear of supernatural or chemical interference added another layer of paranoia to an already stressful reproductive environment. Royal physicians were sometimes foreign spies, whose real mission was to gather intelligence about the queen's reproductive capacity and provide false medical advice that might reduce her fertility. The medical privacy that modern people take for granted was impossible for royal women whose reproductive health was a matter of state security. Court ceremonies around royal fertility were carefully choreographed to send political messages to foreign observers. The announcement of pregnancies, the celebration of births, and even the mourning of miscarriages were diplomatic communications designed to influence international perceptions of dynastic stability. Let's examine the cultural variations in royal fertility expectations across different civilizations. Islamic royal women in the Ottoman Empire operated under different rules than European Christian queens. But they faced similar pressures to produce male heirs while navigating complex political hierarchies. Ottoman imperial women could rise from slave status to become mothers of sultans, which created different opportunities and challenges compared to European queens who were typically born into royal families. The Ottoman system was more meritocratic in some ways, but also more brutal in its treatment of unsuccessful women. Chinese imperial concubines faced similar competitive pressures, but within even more rigidly hierarchical systems. The Forbidden City contained hundreds of women competing for the emperor's attention and hoping to produce the next heir. Success in this system required not just fertility, but also political cunning and survival skills. Indian royal women in various kingdoms faced different challenges depending on local customs regarding female inheritance, widow remarriage, and royal polygamy. Some Indian queens could rule in their own right, while others were expected to commit suicide when their husbands died. The diversity of cultural approaches to royal fertility was enormous. African royal systems often included complex relationships between multiple wives, each representing different tribal alliances. Fertile queens in these systems weren't just producing heirs, they were maintaining political networks that could span vast geographical areas and multiple ethnic groups. The collision between different cultural systems during colonial periods created new challenges for royal fertility. European colonizers often tried to impose their own succession laws on indigenous royal families, disrupting traditional approaches to marriage, inheritance, and political authority. Let's return to European examples and discuss Catherine Parr, Henry V's sixth and final wife, who survived partly because she focused on stepmother duties rather than biological reproduction. Catherine understood that at Henry's age and health condition, her value lay in managing his existing children rather than producing new ones. Catherine Parr's approach illustrates how some queens adapted their strategies based on their husbands' ages and political situations. Instead of competing in the fertility game, she positioned herself as the indispensable manager of Henry's dynastic legacy through his existing children. Catherine's relationship with Henry's children from previous marriages was politically crucial because it influenced the succession crisis that followed Henry's death. Her support for Protestant education and her influence over Edward VI's upbringing had long-term consequences for English religious policy. The success of Catherine Parr's non-reproductive strategy demonstrates that royal women could sometimes find alternative paths to political influence. But her approach only worked because Henry already had children from previous marriages and was too old and sick to prioritize new reproduction. Catherine Parr's survival also depended on her political intelligence and ability to avoid the theological controversies that had destroyed previous queens. She understood that Henry's later years were dangerous for anyone who challenged his religious or political authority, regardless of their reproductive contributions. Let's examine the medical interventions that royal women endured in attempts to improve their fertility. Medieval and early modern physicians prescribed bizarre treatments, including special diets, bloodletting, prayer regimens, and consumption of ground animal parts that were believed to enhance reproductive capacity. Royal women were subjected to internal examinations by male physicians who had no understanding of female anatomy or reproductive biology. These examinations were often painful, humiliating, and medically useless, but they were considered necessary for diagnosing fertility problems. The medications prescribed for royal fertility problems were often dangerous and sometimes fatal. Mercury lead and other toxic substances were common ingredients in fertility treatments. Queens who survived these medical interventions were probably succeeding despite their medical care, rather than because of it. Religious treatments for fertility problems included pilgrimages to holy sites, consumption of blessed objects, and participation in special ceremonies designed to invoke divine intervention. These practices were psychologically comforting, but had no biological effects on reproductive capacity. Some queens developed their own theories about fertility based on personal observation and experience. These informal medical insights were sometimes more accurate than official physician recommendations, but queens had limited ability to reject professional medical advice without appearing to reject royal obligations. The lack of effective medical knowledge meant that royal fertility was essentially a matter of biological luck, combined with political strategy. Queens who succeeded reproductively were often those who were genetically fortunate rather than those who followed the best medical advice. Now let's discuss the psychological coping mechanisms that fertile queens developed to manage the intense pressures they faced. Many queens became deeply religious, interpreting their reproductive success or failure through theological frameworks that provided emotional comfort and social justification. Letter writing became a crucial outlet for queens who needed to express their fears, hopes, and frustrations about fertility without appearing to question royal obligations. The correspondence between royal women often included coded discussions about reproductive strategies and emotional support networks. Some queens developed close relationships with female courtiers or religious advisors who could provide informal counseling about fertility problems. These relationships were politically dangerous because they could be interpreted as evidence of disloyalty or inappropriate influence, but they were psychologically necessary. The development of court rituals around pregnancy and childbirth provided structure and social support for queens during vulnerable periods. These ceremonies also served political functions, but they created communities of women who shared similar experiences and could offer practical advice. Queens who experienced multiple miscarriages or infant deaths sometimes developed what modern medicine would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. But medieval and early modern cultures had no understanding of psychological trauma, so these women were expected to continue their reproductive duties without acknowledgement of their emotional suffering. The isolation that many queens experienced during their reproductive years was profound. They were surrounded by people, but couldn't trust anyone with their genuine fears and concerns about fertility. This emotional isolation probably contributed to the mental health problems that affected many royal women. Let's examine how royal fertility intersected with military conflicts and warfare. Pregnant queens and royal mothers often became military targets because eliminating them could destabilize enemy kingdoms more effectively than winning individual battles. Sieges of royal residences often focused on capturing or killing pregnant queens and royal children. Military commanders understood that controlling royal fertility was more strategically valuable than controlling territory or resources. Queens sometimes had to evacuate their kingdoms while pregnant or with young children, creating logistical challenges that could influence military outcomes. The mobility limitations imposed by pregnancy and child care made royal women particularly vulnerable during conflicts. Some queens participated directly in military campaigns while managing their reproductive obligations. Margaret of Anjou led armies while protecting her young son during the Wars of the Roses. These women had to balance military leadership with maternal duties in ways that male rulers never faced. The ransoming and exchange of royal women and children became common diplomatic practices during medieval conflicts. Royal fertility made women and children valuable commodities in negotiations between warring kingdoms. Military conflicts sometimes disrupted royal marriage negotiations and fertility strategies that had taken years to develop. Wars could separate royal couples, delay planned marriages, or eliminate potential spouses, forcing queens to completely revise their reproductive and political strategies. Let's discuss the economic dimensions of royal fertility in more detail. The cost of maintaining royal households large enough to accommodate multiple children and their staffs was enormous. These expenses had to be balanced against other royal obligations like military campaigns and infrastructure projects. Royal fertility required investment in education, military training, and diplomatic preparation for children who might inherit various territories or marry into foreign royal families. The cost per child was much higher for royal families than for any other social class. The economic value of successful royal fertility extended beyond immediate succession issues to include the political alliances and trade agreements that resulted from strategic marriages. Queens like Maria Theresa essentially used their children as diplomatic assets that could generate economic benefits for decades. Some kingdoms developed specialized financial systems to manage the costs of royal fertility. These included separate budgets for child rearing, education, marriage negotiations, and support for adult children who didn't inherit thrones but still required appropriate lifestyles. The economic pressure to produce male heirs was partly driven by the inheritance laws that excluded daughters from inheriting valuable territories. Kingdoms that allowed female inheritance had different economic incentives for royal fertility, but most European legal systems prioritized male succession. Royal fertility could also create economic problems when successful queens produced too many children who required financial support. The cost of maintaining large royal families sometimes contributed to national debt and political instability. Now let's examine the technological and communication innovations that affected royal fertility. The development of better transportation systems allowed royal women to travel more safely during pregnancy and enabled them to maintain correspondence with distant family members. Improvements in literacy and writing materials allowed queens to document their experiences and share information about reproductive strategies. The letters that survive from this period provide insights into how royal women understood and managed their fertility obligations. The printing press eventually allowed for the distribution of medical texts that included information about reproduction and child rearing. But this information was often inaccurate and sometimes dangerous, so technological improvements didn't necessarily improve outcomes for royal women. Better record-keeping systems allowed royal families to track genealogies, inheritance claims, and marriage possibilities more accurately. These administrative improvements made fertility strategies more sophisticated, but also more complex and politically fraught. Communication networks that connected European royal courts allowed queens to share information about medical treatments, political strategies, and child-rearing practices. These informal networks were crucial for developing effective approaches to royal fertility challenges. The development of better preservation techniques for food and medicine allowed royal households to maintain supplies that were believed to improve fertility and support healthy pregnancies. Whether these supplies were actually beneficial is questionable, but they provided psychological comfort. Let's discuss the long-term historical consequences of royal fertility strategies. The genetic mixing that resulted from strategic royal marriages created genetic conditions that affected royal families for generations. The Habsburg tendency toward inbreeding eventually produced rulers who couldn't produce heirs. The political alliances created through royal fertility strategies influenced major historical events including wars, colonial expansion, and religious conflicts. The children of fertile queens became the rulers who made decisions that affected millions of people across multiple continents. The cultural expectations about women's roles that developed around royal fertility influenced broader social attitudes about marriage, motherhood, and female authority. Royal women's reproductive experiences provided models that affected how non-royal women understood their own obligations and opportunities. The legal systems that developed to manage royal succession and inheritance were eventually applied to non-royal families and influenced the development of property law, family law, and women's legal rights across European societies. The medical practices that developed around royal fertility influenced broader medical approaches to women's health and reproduction. Some of these practices were harmful, but the attention focused on royal women's health also contributed to medical innovations that eventually benefited all women. The documentation of royal fertility experiences provided historical sources that modern scholars use to understand medieval and early modern approaches to reproduction, child rearing, and family structures. These records are crucial for reconstructing the lived experiences of women during these periods. In conclusion, the most fertile queens in history weren't just biological success stories. They were political strategists, economic planners, military tacticians, and cultural innovators who used their reproductive capacity to reshape the world. Their children became the rulers who conquered empires, launched religious reformations, and created the political foundations of modern nation-states. These women faced pressures that modern people can barely comprehend. Yet they developed strategies and coping mechanisms that allowed them to influence historical events on a scale that few individuals in any era have matched. Their fertility was their weapon, their shield, their currency, and their legacy. The stories of history's most fertile queens remind us that reproduction has always been political, that motherhood has always been strategic, and that the private decisions of royal women had public consequences that lasted for centuries. They turned biological functions into political power, and in doing so, they changed the course of human history.